Well, we're back again, showing this week.
Yes.
We're actually showing Al doing his presentation, showing all of his scratch-built cars, or not all, because there's too many of them, but a whole bunch of his scratch-built cars to the local meeting of the NMRA, which I taped because we were going to use it in the retrospective on the first 100 cars that we never made because he passed away after finishing number 98. And never got it done.
Just never know.
And I really haven't had the heart to do anything with the footage, but it's been almost 2 years, and
we hate to. I mean, there's a lot of information.
There's a lot of information, and it's really neat. So this is Al presenting his cars to the NMRA. Check it out.
No, I don't. I do two things, right? I play the meanest jazz clarinet you'll ever hear, and I build cars, right?
Oh wow! Look at this.
Isn't that pretty? Al scratch-built cars, for years and years and years, mostly out of plastic. But we'll let Al explain that, because he has a process.
I enjoy the challenge of scratch building, and it's fun for me. I don't mind sitting down for a month and a half and whittling away at a pile of styrene, turning it into a car. Also, you get exactly what you want when you scratch build. You don't have to compromise very much. American Railroad Freight Car, which is the red book, I've had that guy about 15 years now, and I build about half the cars in it. Not quite. They're just absolutely stunning books, and they can give you every detail, line drawings, construction photos, pictures of wrecks with the car sitting on its side, so you can see every bit of detail on the bottom side. Also, train shed cyclopedias. If you're not familiar with these, shame on you. They've been around for 100 years, and they're starting to become relatively difficult to come by. This one involves cars from the 1890s, and this is volume 1. I've been looking for volume 2 for about 20 years. Another excellent series of books. And again, it involves construction photos mostly in the cyclopedias, but they also incorporate a lot of line drawings, details of passenger car interiors, and everything else you can think of. These books are fantastic if you enjoy research. The American Railroad Freight Car covers all kinds of interesting statistics and histories of the early railroads, what they were doing with gauge and everything else in the world, and some of the ways they circumvented gauge with broad wheels. They had a wheel that was that wide they could run on 3 different gauges, which is a cool idea. I'm not sure how well it switched. I use fewer tools than anybody I hang out with. Everybody in the O-scale guys has more tools than I do, right? I have one electric tool. I do have a drill press, which I haven't used for almost 10 years now because it's been in storage.
Excuse me, it's in my shop.
Yeah, I know, and now it's in Dale's shop, and that's fine, right? But my list of tools is relatively short. I do use a scale rule all the time. Number 11 blade. For years, the guys accused me of just taking a block of styrene and carving away everything that didn't look like the car with a number 11 blade. I do have a razor saw. In fact, I have 3. One of my favorites is one I picked up from Revell that's got the most aggressive teeth I've ever seen on a razor saw, and it's a small one at that. That thing is great for texturing plastic and doing the phony make it look like wood thing. Pin vices, sanding blocks. I got a bunch of sanding blocks, but I made every one of them. Most of them are little tiny things. A glass surface. I have a 12 by 18 piece of 3/8 inch glass, which I consider one of my most valuable tools because it allows me to do flat stuff. Also, the really cool thing about a piece of glass is you can align a square along the edge, and you've got a square setup that you don't have to have a special tool for. What else? Needle files, I've got a few of those. I do have an airbrush. It again is a 25-year-old single action airbrush, which works great for me. Several types of clamps, most of which are clothespins. They work just fine, right? And some weights. Steve Strebel years and years ago made me a square weight, which he was testing out his new milling machine, and I've used that a lot. All right. Now, do I have more tools than these? Yeah, I do, but I use them so rarely it isn't funny. The one thing I do use a ton is a Northwest Shortline sanding square. And I use my glass plate and my sanding square in conjunction with a carpenter's tri-square. The sanding square is only about 8 inches wide, maybe even less than that. But if you use the square, you can align half a dozen longer pieces, butt it to the square, slide the whole thing in, and sand away to your heart's content. The sanding square has a little table here, and the block goes back and forth on there. Align your square here, put your material in there so it extends a little bit past the ruler, and you can sand anything up to, you know, I've done 14 inches, I guess, in there. And it works just great, right? And the same thing is true of your glass plate. Glass plate, and you let it extend a little bit past the edge of the bench. Align your square, clamp it in place with some clothespins, and then you have a nice squaring tool, right? And you don't have to worry about, you know, trying to figure out what is square and what is not. Hopefully it just automatically squares itself. Because I'm doing mostly wooden car era stuff, I'm looking at mostly styrene. The reason I use styrene, especially for frames, is that it's immune to humidity and reasonable heat change, so you're not going to have the thing twisting and warping on you. It's more forgiving when it's dropped, and I've dropped every one of these cars, right? You guys are not allowed to drop them. I can drop them, all right. It does require texturing, and you have to go through the game of trying to make styrene look like wood, but that's not that difficult to do. Again, it's just running a razor saw obliquely down the length of the thing. And then the bodies. What is the prototype made of, right? If it's a box car, I would use scribe styrene almost immediately. It works very well, and you can texture the outside of it, you can carve it up, put holes in it and everything else in the world, and it still make it look quite a bit like wood. You got to be careful with it when you paint it. You can seal it first, but then it has a tendency to not want to stain very well, and wood always looks best when you start with a stain, I think. Plastic looks pretty good when you start with a stain as well. One slat at a time, and that would be like for a stock car. Wood seems to work better than styrene, especially if you're doing very thin slats. Styrene will warp with just a small amount of glue when you're talking about something that's 10 thousandths thick, even though it can be quite wide. Horizontal tanks, I would suggest using styrene. Styrene, it's much easier to make it look like steel, right? If you're doing a wooden tank car, which would be pickle cars, vinegar cars, early oil cars, or early water cars, I would use wood for that. And again, it's mostly the weathering technique and the coloration of the wood. Wooden tank cars look really beat up, even when they're brand new. So if you're doing a pickle car, use wood for the bins, whatever they are. Any detail that looks fragile, hand grabs, ladders, brake cylinders, brake wheels, should be in brass, all right? And if you don't know where to get them in brass, I found a relatively new outfit, Trout Creek Engineering. They do brass in HO and O, right? And they're a Denver outfit. The guy who owns it does a lot of his own casting, right? He also stocks precision scale parts and Grantline parts. The only brass part that I understand Grantline is making anymore are the turnbuckles, and they are the O-scale turnbuckles, so that doesn't do us any good, right? Most of you guys. The reason you want to use brass is because plastic is very fragile. I'm sure you've noticed that. And if you're scratch building something, particularly if you're preparing it for a contest, and the judge picks it up, and the first thing he does is knock off the brake wheel, he's not going to be too happy, and you're not going to be happy either. So use brass. It's not that difficult to work with if you haven't tried it. All right. Okay, construction sequence, and I debated whether to go over this. I have built cars in every order you can imagine. I really have discovered there's an easy way to make them. Start with the body first, right? And get the body all put together, get the doors cut in it, windows cut in it, anything you want. And then fit the frame to the body, right? It's much easier to fit the frame to the body than it is to fit the body to the frame. A lot of the cars I do have removable roofs because I'm fascinated with what goes on inside the car, right? So the roof goes on last. The easiest solution to building frame body is to start with a flat car. You know, and that way we've avoided the possibility of misaligning a frame or making a body too narrow and it won't fit. You know. I am a dyed-in-the-wool user of flow quill, and I'm so annoyed at its demise that, right? Okay, so whatever you feel is a decent paint, go ahead and try it. I double dare you to not have it all flake off the brass parts. Weathering. My choice for weathering is chalk. I really much prefer chalk to just about everything else, and I've done weathering with an airbrush and flow quill paint and all kinds of other stuff, dumping my ashtray on top of the car. That works pretty well too, although that's pretty close to chalk. But the availabilities of colors, you can match the dust on your car to the scenery you have, which is a cool trick anyway. The thing about weathering with chalk is you cannot over weather because the minute you spray it with dull coat, half of it goes away. So you usually end up weathering it 3 or 4 times before you get the finish you absolutely want, right? The one suggestion I have is avoid oil chalks. They have an oil-based pastel, which doesn't work at all well. And they're really cheap, and I know why they're cheap now, because they don't work. All right, that's it. All right, this car won a special award. All right, and I'll pass this around. And the award is from Northeastern Scale Models for a wood-crafted model, right? Okay, this car has exactly 12 pieces of wood in it. They are the slats on the platforms at the end of the car. Everything else is plastic. Oops, all right. And you can kind of push it around. But look at the finish on the inside. The finish was done with a kind of a natural wood color, and then I hit it with chalks, and yellow and brown and red, and then oversprayed it with gloss coat. And it looks like varnished wood, right? And you're welcome to pass that around if you'd like to do that. No. All right. I mean, who is supposed to know more about wood? Northeastern Scale Models, or the pathetic little schmuck from Utah who happened to enter, you know. I mean, they're the ones who are supposed to know wood, not I. I do not know wood. All right. Anyway. So that's if you're tired of, you know, warping wood and things like that when you start finishing it, try styrene, paint it kind of a neutral wood tan, light tan, wood color, and then go after it with some chalk and then overspray it with gloss coat. And I think you'll be quite surprised. Size is more important than scale, all right? If you look at the end railings on that thing, you will find this nice little dentia detail on it. That is N-scale freight car ladder, all right? And I've also used HO scale freight car ladder, right? And it works out just fine. So when you don't become obsessed with your scale, unless of course it's Z, that starts creating some problems, unfortunately, because not much comes in that scale other than the Z-scale trains. But there's all kinds of neat stuff, dollhouse details you can use, and a lot of dollhouse scale, details come in 48 scale. There is a ton of military stuff out there, and that comes in 87th, which is really close to 92nd, whatever HO is. 80s, yeah, okay. So in terms of trying to know exactly everything that's out there, it's almost impossible, but it's a good idea to thumb through the armored books and the dollhouse books and anything else you can get your hands on. Again, if it looks right, if it looks about like it's going to fit your train, it probably will. All right, so just because it says S scale on the package doesn't mean it won't fit HO. The roof on this car, which is sneaky stuff. I double dog dare you to guess what it is. You know those fabulous little laundry dryer sheets that you throw in the dryer to take the static out of your clothes, right? The expensive ones. Downy is the best. Makes the tar paper you will never be able to forget, right? And you're killing two birds with one stone, right? But don't buy the cheap stuff. The fabric on the cheap stuff has a tendency to fall apart. So if you buy a little bit upscale, you'll be better off. And this solves the problem of marker lights. That's an O-scale marker light. That's all out of brass. The marker light is not that difficult to do. And if I use one of my wonderful little clothespin clamps to clamp the two opposing sides on and then solder the third one on, you don't have to worry about it falling apart, hopefully, right? Whoops. I hope that wasn't one of my cars. All right. Yeah, that's what I thought it was. Okay, now, my big concern here today is to let you guys fondle the cars, look at them, and let's generate some questions and see if I can answer them, right? And I'm making the irrational assumption that you have all handled cars before, so you won't drop them on the floor, right? Where am I? I know. All right, this is a pickle car. Again, that particular pickle car, I kind of averaged 2 or 3 cars together, and that was actually the third one I did. The first two I did in ON3. That is a vinegar car, and then that also is an average of a couple of different car designs, some of which are in the books, right? The tanks, by the way, on the pickle car, I used this to cut a disc in styrene, right? And then I put a little edge around it to give it some height, and then it's individual wooden boards all the way around the pickle cart, right? And I did 3 of them, and it can be really boring. But the only thing I did to the stick was slightly taper one edge so it had a tendency to fit a little bit tighter on the edges. And you know, once the tanks are done, you just stain it, and then if you want to put some paint over it, that's fine, right? And the stain I used was just alcohol and shoe polish. I think I used gin and shoe polish, actually. What else is gin for, right? Weathering your cars. And the tanks here were done exactly the same way. A styrene disc, and then I have the wood glued on the outside. Here we have a car that never was. This is the original patent Tiffany reefer, right? And the ice bunker is on top. Again, all right, so the roof comes off, and you can see the exposed ice bunker on the inside. This car was never produced, but Tiffany won his first patent for a reefer with that design. All right, which I thought that was a fun idea, and that is out of the American Railroad freight car book. The roof is loose. I use dimensional styrene for frames. Whoops, what was that? Okay, never mind. A frame on a standard gauge passenger car or freight car from the era I'm working with was anywhere from 10 by 6 to 12 by 6. Mostly in the later period, near the turn of the century, up 2000, they went to 12-inch members on the frame, right? So, and then the earlier cars were smaller than that. And if you look at that 3-foot gauge car, that is 8 by something, 8 by 5, something like that.
Basically evergreen dimensional.
Yeah, evergreen dimensional styrene for anything that's going to be a frame or the blocking at the end of the pickle car, right? Right, and then for a box car or the passenger cars, I'm using 20,000 styrene. The reason I use 20,000 is because I'm gluing it back to back, so I've got styrations on both sides of it, the exterior and the interior, right? One thing I do with particularly passenger cars is the sides will always have all the doors and all the windows cut out before I start assembly, right? And if I'm doing an interior, I do the exterior first, glue the interior in, then I go back and cut out all the windows in the interior, right? It makes it a little bit quicker and a little bit easier, all right? And plan on burning through half a dozen number 11 blades while you're cutting the things out. I mean, a dull blade does not work. I just glue them together. I don't know. Interestingly enough, I very rarely had sheet styrene warp.
Oh, I mean, just apply glue around the edge?
Nope. I'll paint the whole thing with glue. I use a 3/4 inch wide brush, dip it in the glue bottle, paint it.
You're using
Oh, for years I used testers. It was okay, but then Alan Kenny at Douglas Models suggested I try the Tamiya thin set, and that stuff is great, right? Tamiya thin set to me is the best styrene glue around, right? I still use testers occasionally because the Tamiya can be a little bit difficult to come by. Now, there is a car that has not been painted. All right, and make sure that goes all the way around. Again, observe the texturing, particularly on the frame. The roof comes off on that, and the frame is not attached yet, right? All of the grab irons and some of the other stuff on there are all 20 thousandths brass. I practice what I preach. I build sturdy, right? And that is a grain car. So the grain doors on the inside, they work. They pivot up, and the side doors close as well. All right. Now this guy, be careful with the railings. You can pick it up from the ends or from the dome. I mentioned that round is more challenging than square. This thing is a pain. It took me forever to figure out how to put that together. And I'm pretty good at puzzles. Moderately good, anyway. Right. The one thing that made this much easier to build, the tank car, was I used Grant Line domes for the ends of the car, all right? And it just so happens that the standard gauge dome of the 1890s was the same size as the narrow gauge dome in the 1930s when they were transporting a lot of Gramps oil and stuff. 30s? Well, 20s, yeah. The lettering is all done with Woodland Scenics dry transfers. I'm not a great fan of wet transfers, mostly because you have to start with a gloss finish to really make them disappear. Although I did a couple of projects in N scale where I used wet transfers, and I found out if you overpainted the transfer with a kind of a wash of Floquil, which no longer exists, that it made the lines around the outside of the lettering disappear. All right, and then you could hit it with dull coat, and it worked out rather well. Right, but I haven't done that for a long time.
At what point
All right, now I hope you guys took notes because there will be a test, and I'm considering a term paper as well. So,
Thank you very much.
you are welcome.
Well, there you go. That was Al.
Yeah. Wow.
I missed the guy.
I do too.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit of an object lesson for all of us. If you've got something to do, do it now.
Yeah.
There's no guarantee of tomorrow.
And, he was just there at the computer and never woke up.
Yeah.
Fell asleep, never woke up. So you just never know. And so if there's something you really want to get done, get her done.
Yep. Every
Get her
day's a
done right
gift.
now. Every
Yep.
day's a gift. Well, anyway, if you haven't been over to the channel, get on over to the channel. And if you're not a subscriber, here's the opportunity with the blue button. Are we ready for that? Ready? Zoink! Right there, blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here on Tuesday with some Collector's Attic
Yep.
stuff. We'll see you then.
See ya. Bye.
Bye-bye.